Force 13 presents the top 10 forecast busts that shocked everyone. The model that falsely cried recurve when small margins mattered. The storm that got a National Weather Service director fired. And the ultimate storm that was not expected. Tropical cyclone forecasting has come on in leaps and bounds over the last few decades. In particular, in the early days of tropical cyclone forecasting, the forecasts themselves weren't all that good and didn't extend out very far. We only got to 72-hour forecasts round about the later part of the 20th century, and only in more recent times, in the last 30 years or so, have we seen forecasts go out to 5 days. Well, with the National Hurricane Center experimenting with 7-day forecasts going out, and of course computer models in some cases going all the way out to beyond a month now, of course these forecasts clearly are getting better, although certainly in the more long range they still have a little bit of more room to maneuver and to continue to improve. However, of course, we don't want to throw too much shade at forecasters. It's a tough job, but there are, I'm afraid, 10 terrible busts that we need to point out in our top 10 today. Forecasting busts, how the authorities and most forecasters just didn't see them coming.
Hurricane Gilbert, really known here in Mexico as Gilberto, like the Spanish translation. It was a really devastating hurricane and one of the most intense ever to strike Mexico, and also the strongest.
So Gilbert started off in the central Atlantic and then moved through the Lesser Antilles as a weak tropical storm. And it really started to ramp up quite quickly as we got towards the middle part of September, reaching Category 4 status before striking Jamaica as a very powerful Category 3, and then reaching Category 5 in the Western Caribbean and becoming exceptionally strong before striking Cozumel and Quintana Roo in Mexico. The storm then continued on towards the central part of Mexico, moved inland after passing over the Gulf, and then swept up towards the northeast. On our analysis, we have the storm at 190 miles per hour and an estimated pressure down to 882 millibars based on recon gaps. What's most notable about the storm in this context is one of the computer models, the Clipper, which consistently forecasted this storm to recurve time and again. And guess what? Gilbert never did it. The National Hurricane Center, thankfully, were a little bit more on the ball than that particular model, and of course they had more forecasting aids at their disposal, and they didn't completely go with that. Their forecasting was much better than that particular model run. As most people know, Gilbert looked absolutely phenomenal at peak, and its peak was between its crossing of Jamaica and its arrival in Mexico. Both countries were substantially affected by the storm, with Jamaica probably receiving the worst impacts of any of the locations that Gilbert tracked over. Of course, the impacts were wide-ranging and quite visually substantial, as well, as we can see on these images, both from Jamaica and from parts of Mexico. And the storm made 3 very prominent landfalls throughout the course of its life.
Hurricane Gilbert also devastated my hometown. Of course, back in 1988, I wasn't born. I was minus 10 years old. But yeah, Gilbert, the devastation that it caused in the Yucatan Peninsula and more mainly in Monterrey in the northeastern side of Mexico was incredible. Record-breaking rain, the flash flooding, and Gilbert on my hometown specifically, which is really most known of it, is basically Gilbert destroyed everything on its path, and it killed a lot of people as well, which also caused a lot of the impact of it, how the storm managed to kill a lot of people.
Well, here are the statistics. In total then, the storm did kill 433, and it caused a substantial amount of damage. As you can see, 103,000 buildings damaged and 60,000 destroyed. The destroyed number in the top 100. In terms of damages, it amounted to $7.1 billion, which was one of the highest ever at that time, and 823 millimeters of rainfall fell across the storm's path, which is also in the upper echelons. The 2010 Pacific typhoon season was remarkably quiet. Most people know that. However, there was one storm that caught people off guard in the Philippines. It doesn't look like much. It's a Category 1 making landfall very close to Manila, moving out over the South China Sea as a tropical storm, strengthening again to a Category 1 typhoon, passing very close to Hainan, and finally making landfall as a much weakened storm near Hanoi, Vietnam. The storm peaked with winds of 90 miles per hour. There's just one problem though. Pegasa forecasted that this storm, just 18 hours before it arrived, would make landfall on the border between Aurora and Quezon provinces, which is a fair bit north of where Manila is, which actually got the storm in the end. Well, that's not so bad. You'd have thought they've issued decent warnings, but Manila was only under Signal 1 warnings up until the last minute, and it caused substantial outcry after the storm blindsided the capital. What's more, it's alleged that Pegasa didn't get the word out that they'd raised the signal warning to Signal 2 for Metro Manila just before the storm arrived. Most people didn't get the message. This certainly isn't the place for us to apportion blame, but what happened next was genuinely remarkable. In what is one of very few cases, if any, that we know about, the director of Pegasa, Prisonilo, was dismissed by the president of the Philippines, who'd only been in office for a couple of weeks, President Benigno Aquino. In total, this storm killed at least 64, most if not all of them in the Philippines. Whilst not the deadliest disaster ever, the poor forecasting put the Philippines on notice, and Pegasa had a major shake-up after this. And whilst it was a quiet Pacific typhoon season overall, the Philippines would later be slammed that year by Typhoon Megi in October as a Category 5. And now a storm that was genuinely difficult to predict, and the stakes were much higher because this storm was much stronger. It was Typhoon Lionrock. Well, it wobbled around on the way past Japan in its early days, and then sunk towards the southwest. That was pretty much forecasted, but what happened next certainly was very difficult to forecast. It was corkscrewing around to the east of the Daito Islands and then rapidly intensified as it continued to drift southwestwards to Category 3 status. Weakened a little bit. Exactly when it was going to turn towards the northeast was still under doubt as well. Then it went up to Category 4 status, and off it went towards the coast of Japan, rounding the eastern shores and then making landfall to the east of Sendai. So why did it embark on such a weird track? Well, one of the reasons was competition for space by several other storms that were parading around the area at the time, mixed in with high pressure systems that were bunched around the western Pacific. Lionrock could have died off very early on as well. It was not looking very good for its first few days, barely holding on as a tropical storm. I think it owes itself to how small it was, in that it managed to actually overcome that issue and managed to intensify very quickly in its tight core as it drifted back towards the south near the Daito Islands and the Ryukyu Islands. Whilst it was going to be close, it was never explicitly forecasted that the storm would land near Tokyo near its very strong intensity, Category 2 or 3 at that point, but the storm still caused significant damage nonetheless after it struck further north. 550 fatalities from this storm, 35,000 buildings damaged, and 20,000 destroyed. A very costly storm, $3.8 billion in damages, the 68th highest worldwide, and 342 millimeters of rainfall. And now a storm that most people will remember for being very difficult to forecast from the get-go. A storm that reached its first peak unexpectedly and reached its second peak and was overestimated on what it would do at that point when it got close to land. Of course, this storm stalling and moving very erratically as it arrived there really complicated matters.
Well, it formed in early September, didn't it? It had its first Category 4 peak out in the eastern Atlantic. Then weakened back down to a tropical storm, but by then we knew that it was going to be quite a big storm for Carolinas especially.
And you can pretty much foresee it before it happens. You can see the ridge extends all the way up along the coast of the US, and there's no way at the minute, if this model run is right, which it may not be, there's no way, according to this model run, that Florence could round that bend unless the high pressure shrinks away ridiculously quickly.
Florence was much smaller at its first peak, and then it weakened down to a tropical storm, stayed as a high-end tropical storm on September the 8th, and then eventually got back to hurricane status, and this time the storm was looking much better. It meant business, and it became much larger as it approached the coast of the United States. It only turned northwest after it already became a Category 4, by which point some forecasts were taking the storm close to Category 5 status. But as it happened, Florence was the architect of its own downfall. Its eye wall was disrupted by changes in its structure, and the storm slowing down as it was reaching the cooler waters of the eastern seaboard coastline meant that the storm weakened substantially and wasn't even a major hurricane by the time it made landfall, which is a far cry from the original National Hurricane Center's worst-case forecasts. Of course, on the ground, that probably made things even worse. The wind field expanded as the storm weakened, and of course its big stalling motion along the coast meant that massive amounts of rain fell in some significant parts of North Carolina.
The amount of rain dumped on cities like Wilmington was going to be record amounts, just absolutely enormous amounts of rain, inundating surrounding areas. As it moved inland as a Category 1, I think it was, when it finally made landfall. But it had its brief time where it was moving at only 5 miles per hour towards the coast. So that would have been tricky for forecasters to deal with.
Well, the locals sure remember this storm. It caused 32 fatalities in total, 70,000 buildings damaged. Number of buildings destroyed, not actually fully known, so we've not provided a figure. Of course, in monetary damages, this storm was very costly at over $18 billion, the 14th highest worldwide, and 913 millimeters of rainfall, which is also a pretty high number. An ACE value of 40 units, it was a long-lived storm as well, and the only storm known in history to have 2 Category 4 peaks and a tropical storm in between.
Hurricane Iniki was another storm in the Eastern Pacific in a very active season. It wasn't in the Eastern Pacific, it was in the Central Pacific, but of course the conditions overlapped in that region.
Usually the Hawaiian Islands are protected by heavy ridging, which pushes storms further towards the south. Quite often you see strong storms get pushed well to the south of the Hawaiian Islands, quite harmlessly. However, on this occasion, the ridge faltered. Even whilst Iniki was passing the big island of Hawaii, it was not forecasted to affect any of the islands, but then, before you know it, slam, it's a Category 4 landfall on the westernmost significant population island, Kauai. The storm peaked with winds of 150 miles per hour and a pressure estimate of 931 millibars.
Willie Harbor on the south side of Kauai is home to many residents. Almost without exception, Hurricane Iniki devastated their lives.
It is known for being the 3rd costliest Pacific hurricane on record, and I do think a lot of those damages had to do in part to the strength and also due to that region's terrain. I mean, the terrain is very mountainous, so it's very more prone to flooding, and also even those winds would get funneled through the mountains probably more too.
The main problem with the forecasting was not really knowing the speed of the recurve and how pronounced that recurvature would actually be. Well, it was underestimated, and the storm came barreling through at near top speed.
It was no tropical cyclone warnings or watches 24 hours in advance, so that's where most of its damage came from actually. It mostly came through lack of preparation. I would say the preparation was just there outside of the warnings actually issued. Like, people knew it was going to be bad, basically. So I think they just prepared for the worst, even though the NHC wasn't necessarily on par with what the storm was going to do.
The island of Kauai was equipped with hurricane warning sirens that blared on the morning of the storm's arrival, and that was deemed to have saved many lives. Iniki is still the strongest storm to have ever made landfall on any of the main Hawaiian islands, reaching the island of Kauai as a Category 4, just 3 weeks after Hurricane Andrew blitzed through Florida. 6 fatalities from Iniki, over 10,000 buildings damaged and nearly 2,000 destroyed. The storm was a $1 billion disaster and nearly double that, $1.8 billion, and 100 were injured by the storm's passage. Now onto the storm that thwarted forecasts not once but twice. The first and probably the most glaring error is that the storm was only ever forecasted to be at tropical storm status and never become a hurricane. But Joaquin had other ideas and steered southwestwards, becoming a Category 4 as it lounged around the Bahamas and then slingshotted back towards the northeast again.
It had been a very dead season, to say the least, before Joaquin came along. The only strongest storm that had been come beforehand was Hurricane Danny, and then a very weak Hurricane Fred as well.
Hurricane Joaquin, a really rare storm, I must say. Basically, a storm that nobody expected to be that strong, and it really generated a high debate if whether it was a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane back on the day. Hurricane Joaquin, I remember being on live stream with you guys back on 2015 during my first appearances on the project officially, and man, I remember that we were really having trouble on tracking that storm because it was really quite erratic, and really we weren't really sure about how intense it was going to be, the storm.
Models didn't have a good handle on Joaquin either until it completed its full corkscrew turn in the Bahamas.
This is one possible scenario from the HWRF. I don't want to scare anyone in North Carolina, but that is one possible track. As I say, they've been shifting around. They've been predicting landfalls pretty much everywhere. New Jersey, Long Island, even New England as a hurricane.
And at one point, an even stronger landfall was expected for North Carolina if you believe the HWRF model, a Category 3. Of course, the storm missed by quite a way, but it won't feel that way for South Carolina, which was heavily impacted by rainfall along the storm's periphery. The storm sparked an atmospheric river over the state, causing massive amounts of rainfall to be dropped on the same training area as the band continued to move through. The rest of the storm's progress was pretty normal, moving off towards Bermuda, which was worried for a while, but the storm did weaken before it made its closest pass. It then rounded Bermuda, then moved off over the North Atlantic, where it refused to die for quite a while, although it didn't make that particular top 10 this time around, an extratropical cyclone and then remnant low as it approached the coast of Europe. A lot of people were impressed with Joaquin near its peak, reaching Category 4 status. Let's not forget, at this point in time, Atlantic Basin watchers were absolutely starved of activity over the last few years. There'd been very few strong storms. Of course, what happened in the years following certainly massively changed the state of play.
And its legacy is basically both tied to severe wind surge and flooding impacts across the Bahamas, and to the tragedy at sea involving a cargo ship called the El Faro.
Of course, that contributed to quite a few of the fatalities, 34 in total. Around 100 buildings damaged, 836 buildings destroyed across the storm's path and its extended impacts over in the United States. In terms of damages amounting to at least $200 million, it may well have been higher. Hurricane Joaquin was the harbinger of things to come in future years as we got towards the end of the 2010s in the Atlantic. Now for a storm that looked like for all the world it was going to become a significant hurricane for the southeastern United States. Already a Category 1 before reaching the Leeward Islands, Hurricane Debby was on its way.
Good evening. Her name is Debby, the first big hurricane of the season, and by this time tomorrow, parts of Florida could be evacuated. Right now, there are hurricane warnings in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, and the Bahamas.
We're going to be ahead of the game this time. Finally, for once, be ahead of the game.
So far ahead of the game that there actually wasn't even a game, because Debby completely died off as a tropical storm over Haiti and south of Cuba. There it was, an 85-mile-per-hour peak, but boy did it look like it might have got somewhere. There were three things that completely derailed Debby's progress. The first and most important was land interaction with the very mountainous part of Haiti. The second was the storm center decoupling on the lower and mid levels. And the third was heavy wind shear to finish it off. Well, in the end there were damages, but they were modest. It killed one person and it caused 428 buildings to be damaged. No known figures about buildings destroyed. Those numbers could be low though, as information may not be so good in these areas. In monetary damages, near $1 million in damages, and the rainfall total 127 millimeters from what was supposed to be the first big hurricane of the season. Let's cut straight to it. If you're the weather service in Wellington, you had this storm down at 60 miles per hour at this point. If you're the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, it still wouldn't be recognized for another day and 6 hours beyond that. That was an image of Cyclone Hinano at 6 p.m. on February 21st, clearly looking like a hurricane equivalent storm with a pinhole eye. We have the first peak at Category 3 status, and then we have a second peak at Category 4, which makes it even more remarkable about this storm because of just how much of an anomaly it was in the South Pacific in 1989. The storm formed a few hundred kilometers away from the Pitcairn Islands, and you may have not heard that name mentioned in tropical cyclone literature very much because pretty much no other storms have ever formed near there. And then it reached that peak intensity in an even more strange position before drifting southwards and turning post-tropical. Open and shut case in terms of the storm's actual progression, no real questions to answer apart from how it ended up forming there in the first place. And yes, it may have caught people off guard, but surely the agencies could have done a little bit better than that even back in 1989. Well, they didn't, and their official peak intensity, at least from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, was set at 105 miles per hour, a little bit better, but clearly the storm looks stronger than that. Still, no real harm done. There were no damages or impacts reported, even though the storm tracked not too far away from the island of Rapa in French Polynesia's Base Islands, extremely remote part of the world. One more thing, examine this graphic closely. You'll see those shaded areas are all tropical cyclone tracks, and the one that's coloured in is the track of Cyclone Hinano. It's going a different way from most of those tracks because all of those other ones pretty much were turning post-tropical by the time they were reaching the area where Hinano was thriving. And now for a perfect storm of trouble, an area that rarely receives tropical cyclone impacts, a small system that's primed to intensify quickly over extremely warm waters, and then the ignition begins, and it rapidly intensifies in near record time. Cyclone Gati, peaking with winds of 115 miles per hour, Category 3, as it arrived in Somalia. The storm was very impressive despite having a tiny wind field, making landfall along the eastern coast. The town of Hafun bore the brunt of the impacts from this storm, which looked extremely impressive and managed to build itself up extremely quickly over a matter of 12 to 18 hours. These images were fleeting, but the storm looked like it had been there for a while, even though it had only just developed. Here's this satellite loop showing a little bit more context on just how the storm managed to achieve that and just how short that peak was before the storm moved over the deserts of Africa. Of course, this area was quite unprepared for tropical cyclone impacts, and as a result there were 38 fatalities, 14,000 buildings damaged and 642 destroyed. Of course, this area, unaccustomed to these systems anyway, even an area that's well prepared, would have trouble preparing for such a storm on this last minute as it develops so rapidly. $141 million in damages and 128 millimeters of rainfall recorded. I think most of us already knew which storm would be number 1 on this top 10.
Yeah, Hurricane Otis is by far the most devastating hurricane in Mexico's history. So yeah, Hurricane Otis was a really impressive storm in terms of how intense it got after it was initially just forecasted to be a tropical storm or maybe a minimal hurricane.
It was worse than that actually. On the original National Hurricane Center cone, when the depression first formed that became Hurricane Otis, it was scheduled to become only a tropical storm and not hit land. Of course, the cone was quite broad in this forecast, as you can see, leading a fair amount of uncertainty, but for the intensity, no one saw it coming. Otis rapidly intensified overnight on October the 23rd into the 24th, and by the morning was at 65 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center upgraded their forecast to a hurricane, and hurricane warnings were issued in Mexico with just over 24 hours notice. 12 hours later, it was up to 125 miles per hour, with further strengthening expected and only just above 12 hours notice before the storm's arrival. With only a few hours of daylight remaining until what would become a Category 5 landfall, time was absolutely running out for those on the coast.
And then all of a sudden it intensified into a Category 5 hurricane during the night time. Basically it got everything. Everybody was caught off guard. So, man, I remember vividly how Hurricane Otis was just all of a sudden a Category 5 hurricane and making landfall in the state of Guerrero, and unfortunately in the most important and touristic city of the state of Guerrero, which is Acapulco.
So why was the first forecast so wrong? Well, the National Hurricane Center were betting on the storm being affected by high wind shear later on in its life, which actually did happen for a brief time until the storm managed to overcome it, and then the brakes were off, and off it went. Acapulco was very close to the line of fire from Hurricane Otis. In fact, you could consider it a direct hit. Severe damage in some parts of the city and the surrounding area. Otis is the costliest hurricane in the Pacific Ocean and was one of the most damaging in raw numbers in terms of buildings damaged or destroyed. Could possibly be number 1 on that metric as well, slightly beating Hurricane Pauline. So in total, 82 fatalities from Hurricane Otis. Over 160,000 buildings damaged and 52,000 destroyed. In terms of world numbers, it's in the top 100 on both counts. Monetary damages amounted to just over 12 billion, the 22nd highest worldwide. Hurricane Otis will be remembered for a long time in these parts.
And still in 2026, Guerrero and mainly Acapulco is still not fully recovered from the devastation. So Hurricane Otis definitely it's one of those hurricanes that will remain on Mexico's history for centuries, definitely.
That concludes the top 10 forecast busts that shocked everyone. And now to recap the top 10. Hurricane Gilbert, 1988. Typhoon Conson, 2010. Typhoon Lionrock in 2016. Hurricane Florence in 2018. Hurricane Iniki in 1992. Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. Hurricane Debby in 2000. Cyclone Hinano in 1989. Cyclone Gati in 2020. And a number 1, Hurricane Otis in 2023.